Right, morning everyone. The first poem we're going to look at on these videos is War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy. Carol Ann Duffy is actually the current Poet Laureate. Like we looked at with Tennyson that time, the Poet Laureate is someone who captures the mood of the nation and the nation's response to the world as a whole. So in this poem, Carol Ann Duffy is looking at the idea of a war photographer, a photographer who is sent out to war zones to capture the mood of conflict, to capture the devastation of conflict, and to spread that word around the globe in order to put pressure on governments, in order to put pressure on politicians, on warmongers, on generals, in order to try and effect change and effect the ceasefire in conflicts around the globe. And many of the conflicts around the 1980s, when Carol Ann Duffy wrote this poem, are mentioned in this poem. We'll come on to those a little bit: Belfast, Beirut and Phnom Penh. What I'm going to do is do 15 minutes approximately for the first part and film another 15 minutes, and in each different section we're going to look at a particular key quote in more detail. But I'll read the full poem to start with. In his dark room he is finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church and he, a priest, preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. He has a job to do. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. Rural England, home again to ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. Something is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes. A half-formed ghost. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. 100 agonies in black and white from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and the pre-lunch beers. From the aeroplane he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. Let's look at the first stanza then, and we're set in the photographer's darkroom. If you have a look at the document I've put on the system about the context of war photography, you'll know that before digital filming, everybody had to take a photograph on a cassette spool, which would be spoilt in the light. So you had to develop these photographs in a dark room where the only light would be red, as Duffy mentions in her poem, because red doesn't spoil the film that then develops. As we go through the poem, the photograph starts to develop and it becomes blurry at first before becoming a clear image of the horrors of war. We get from that first line that he is finally alone, that adverb finally suggesting that this is some sort of relief to the war photographer, that this is something that he's been waiting for some time, having flown off and experienced and seen so much suffering. Finally, he's able to get some peace back in his dark room in England. And then you've got that nice juxtaposition, haven't you, on the second line, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The spools that Duffy refers to there are the little cassettes that come from the film. Again, have a look at the picture on the context information that I've given you, because the spools are maybe laid out in their hundreds. The photographer would take many, many images whilst he's over filming the war. And the juxtaposition there is between the suffering, the chaos that exists in war, and the order with which the photographer has to set out his photographs in order to pick the 1 or 2 that he may send off to the newspaper editor for selection. The only light is red and softly glows. Think about the connotations of red. Literally, the red light there suggests the dark room, suggests the light that shines without spoiling the film, as I've said before. But actually, if you think of the connotations of red, we've got the red of bloodshed, the red of death, the red of danger, the red of warning, the red of passion, the red of fire, and all of those images are combined as one to form this interesting image of him being at peace with this red, and that red acts as a constant reminder of all of that blood and fire and anguish and death and bloodshed. as though this were a church and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. Well, let's go back to what a war photographer is there for. A war photographer is there to give a message to the government, give a message to the public, to make awareness, to build people's consciousness around a issue that's happening in some other part of the globe in order to bring pressure, in order to stop it. It's not dissimilar, really, is it, to the idea of a priest giving a mass, telling his public, telling his congregation how they ought to live their lives. So he, as a photographer, is telling the public what is happening out there, how we should change, what we should do as a public in order to put pressure on a government to change their consciousness, to do something about the war that is happening somewhere else. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh. Here they are, Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh. Belfast in Ireland. If you think about Storm on the Island, we've already talked about the troubles in Northern Ireland, and that's certainly a reference to the bloodshed and violence that happened through the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s in Ireland. Beirut is the capital of Lebanon, a small country in the Middle East, and again a country that was really beset by war in the 1980s. Phnom Penh is the capital of Cambodia. Cambodia is a country not too far away from China in Southeast Asia. At one point, they were governed by a tyrannical ruler called Pol Pot, who killed an enormous amount of his public in order to maintain his military charge and his power. So again, it's a reference to that regime, which is called the Khmer Rouge. Notice with those three places, those three conflicts, you've got the full stops after each one. Duffy's giving us the impression that we should pause after each conflict. Belfast, then a pause. Beirut, then a pause. Phnom Penh, another pause. And that pause is deliberate. The use of those full stops there we would call a caesura, a stop in the middle of the line. And those stops in the middle of the line are used as either breaks, or in this case from Duffy, perhaps more of a pause for thought. We're supposed to think about each of these individual conflicts. And that triadic structure, that list of three, is crucial, isn't it? Because we've got the sense that there are three conflicts that she's listed, but there's an endless stream of conflicts happening all over the world that perhaps would fit in here to give that pause for thought. But Duffy hasn't got that space in her poetry to write every single one. So we're supposed to pause and think about each one. We're supposed to take our time to think about the bloodshed within each of those particular conflicts where millions and millions of people were dying. And then our key quote for this part of the session: all flesh is grass. It's a very deliberate, short phrase put at the end of this particular stanza by Duffy. All flesh is grass. On the basic level, of course, it's a metaphor. But let's have a look here at all of the different things that this metaphor suggests. I've tried to draw here the idea of grass, a lawn. And each lawn of grass we might call grass, but it's made up, isn't it, of individual little blades of grass. Each individual blade of grass represents perhaps one individual whose life is tragically cut short in conflict. And so here we've got the imagery of grass, not as an individual, but as an unfeeling mass. The sense here that Duffy is giving us is that warmongers, generals, those who engage in conflict, just cut down people without any thought to their feelings, without any thought to these people as individuals. They are just a mass to be cut down. And again, like all of those images that I'm trying to teach you in the live lessons as well as these videos, we need to try and get three levels of inference, three layers of interpretation. That's why this particular quote is particularly good for that. So we've got that idea of the lack of individuality, the indiscriminate killing of a public. But we've also got this idea of how much bloodshed, how much death there is in one single conflict without any real thought. Just think about cutting the grass. And it's something we all do every 2 weeks or so in the summer, isn't it? We go out with our lawnmowers, we cut the grass. That doesn't seem so sinister until you apply it to this metaphor. All flesh is grass. Each one of those is an individual. Think about the numbers, the sheer scale of devastation and death caused by cutting grass, but in this case not the grass. The metaphorical reading here is mown down in conflict, killed in gunfire, killed in bonfire, bombfire. So that killing is quick, indiscriminate, devastating, as I've suggested on the board here. Finally, in terms of that particular image, we might think about what the grass is and how we as people, we as tissue, we as living beings actually re-nourish the grass in our death. And that in itself is quite a sinister image, isn't it? Because in our death, our bodies turn to the ground and re-nourish the ground. So the idea here that Duffy's trying to get across to us perhaps is that in our death, we re-nourish the earth to grow more. That's really suggesting that there's always more people to kill, there's always more grass to grow. And that in itself suggests the never-ending cycle, the never-ending devastation of conflict and war across the globe. So just to sum up that first stanza, we're back in England now, we're back in the darkroom, we've got that connotational idea of red, literally suggesting the darkroom, the red colour of the darkroom, but also there's more than a hint there, isn't there, of that bloodshed, of that death, of that danger that the war photographer has witnessed. We've got the interesting juxtaposition of the spools of suffering and the ordered rows, the order out of chaos that the war photographer has to make his job to do. We've got that listing, that triadic structure of the three conflicts across the globe. And then we've got that final image, all flesh is grass, the real crucial metaphor that Duffy ends that first stanza with.